Hi everyone, this video is for section 7.4, Mental Calculations with Percents. Even though this section does deal with mental math, I'm going to obviously go ahead and record all of my thoughts on the screen for you. So essentially what this section is about is working with benchmark percentages. So for example, knowing how to quickly determine 10%, 5%, and 1%. If we're able to figure out those relatively quickly, then we can go ahead and use those to help build to find bigger percentage values. So for example, 25% or 15%. So to begin, I'm going to start off with 10%. And what I want you to note with 10%, another way of writing 10% would be to write that as 0.01, or in other words, 10 hundredths. Or again, if we read it like that, then we would be saying 10 over 100. And if you reduce that, that would be 1/10. So there's a bunch of different ways that you can represent 10%. But what I want you to note here is essentially what I have in my final fraction, so 1/10. So in other words, if I wanted to find 10% of 40, I could quickly just do 40 divided by 10, which would result in a 4. So if we chose to work with the fraction, this is how you would do that. However, if you decided to work with, say, the idea of a decimal, this would become, instead of 10% of 40, we could write this as 10 hundredths of, or in other words, times 40. So if we did that, just to kind of show the long of it, put a 0 to hold that, and then 1 times 0 is 0, 1 times 4 is 4, and then I have 2 digits after the decimal place, so I'm going to move this in twice. That is also going to result in a 4. You also have a shortcut. So if I'm asking you to do 10% of 40, what I can do is I can take 40, and I can essentially just move the decimal in once. And then we'll see that I also get 4. So as you can see, no matter which option you are picking, you will always arrive at the same solution. So again, for example, if we work with 10% of 6,200. The shortcut would say to take 6,200 and move the decimal in one space. So then my answer would be 620. Again, if we were to approach this problem and do 6,200 divided by 10, we would see that it would become 620 when we reduce. Likewise, if we did 6,200 times 10 hundredths, or if you wanted to do 1/10, because again, that is the same thing, it would just be removing the 0 at the end, we should get the same solution. So my first row, if I leave the 0 in there, is going to be just 0, because 0 times 0, 0 times 0, 0 times 2, and 0 times 6. And then we'll go ahead and we'll put a 0 in that placeholder so that I don't accidentally put my numbers in there. So 1 times 0, 1 times 0, 1 times 2, and 1 times 6. Add this down. And then again, we want to note that there are 2 digits after the decimal places, so we're going to go in 2. And notice again, we do get 620. So finally, if we look at 10% of 82, we could again start with 82, locate that decimal, and just move it in once. So our solution will become 8.2. And again, if we did all 3 methods, we would arrive at 8.2 each time. So I would encourage you to pause the video if you would like and go ahead and verify that. I'm going to go ahead and continue on. So if I wanted to, say for example, do 20% then of these numbers. So let's go ahead and label this, or put the heading in. I'm actually going to scoot this up all the way. Okay. So let's do 20%. And here's what I'm referring to is once you know 10%, you can find basically any multiple of 10 beyond that. So again, one of our original problems, we worked with 40. So let's do 20% of 40. So mentally, if we looked at this, we could say, well, I know 10% of 40 is 4. The reason why I know this is because if I take 40 and I do my quick trick, I do get 4. Well, 20% is double 10%. So that must mean then that I can take my 4 and I can multiply it by 2 to get 8. So 20% of 40 would be 8. If we were to go ahead and do 20% of 6,200, don't want to forget that word, we could again say, well, I know 10% of 6,200. If I use my shortcut, for example, I could move this in once. That will give me 620. Okay, so again, another way of looking at this would be 20% is the same thing as 10% plus 10%. So that must mean then, if 10% of 6,200 is 620, then 20% must be 620 doubled. So we can either add 620 to itself, or we can multiply it by 2. They're again doing the same thing, because if you recall, multiplication is just a shorthand of adding the same digits, or adding the same numbers to themselves. So then this must mean that I'm going to get 1,240. Finally, if we did 20% of 82, we can do the same thing. I can state that 10% of 82, getting ahead of myself, is 8.2. So 20% of 8.2, not 8.2, sorry, of 82 is going to be 8.2 plus 8.2, or if you want to look at it as 8.2 times 2, in either case we're going to get 16.4 as our solution. Okay, so bear with me. We're going to do a few more items and then we're going to go from there. So let's clear that out. Okay, so now we're going to take a look at the idea of 15%. And we're going to do a different problem this time. So let's say that we do 15% of $47.35. Okay, so here's how we can do this. I would suggest we break this down. So for 15, I would say that's going to be a 10% plus 5%. So the reason why I do this is as follows. I know that 10% of $47.35, we can go ahead and essentially move things around. So I want to locate that decimal, and I'm going to move it in once. So I know that 10% of $47.35 is going to come out to 4.735. But again, we're dealing with money, so we should probably approximate this. So what I would say is this would be $4.74, because again, I want to round to the nearest cent. So I'm going to round to that hundredths place. And notice that there is a 5 next to it, so that's why I'm going to round up from a 3 to a 4. Okay, so now we need to think of this idea of, well, what would 5% be? Well, do you all agree that 5% is going to essentially be equal to 10% divided by 2, or in other words, cut in half? So if that's the case, what we can do is we can take our $4.74 and cut it into 2. So again, this would become, not that. 2 can go into 4 2 times. And there's my decimal. I want it to match or mirror. I'm going to bring down the 7, so I can put that in 3 times now. And then I can put in a 7 to make that go completely away. So then, again, I'm going to bring my work above to here. 10% we said was $4.74, and then 5% came out to $2.37. If we add all of that up, we should get a grand total of $7.11. Okay, let's look at one more. Every time I try to move the screen up, I end up drawing a line. Sorry about that. Okay, so let's look at 15% of $8.13. Okay. And what I want to do with this one, everyone, is I want to kind of do a little bit more rough rounding here, because again, technically we're doing mental math, so we really shouldn't be utilizing pen and paper. But again, just follow along, because again, if we're doing mental math, we sometimes might have to do some estimation. So we might lose some of that accuracy. And again, if you've read the textbook, you'll kind of see that they've done some rounding in order to get to their solution. So again, I can justify, or I can argue, that 15% is going to boil down to 10% plus 5%. So I'm going to focus my attention on doing 10% of $8.13. And again, what I can do is I can take my 813 and I can locate that decimal point and scoot it to the left 1. This is going to give us 813 thousandths, but that doesn't make sense for our money system. And again, also because I'm telling you we're going to do this a little bit more rougher in terms of estimation, I'm going to say that this is roughly 80 cents. If we're doing this mentally, it's going to be easier to hold 80 cents in your mind as opposed to 81 cents, potentially. So again, that's why I'm also using these approximate symbols here to indicate to myself that this is not completely accurate, it's just close. Okay, so now let's go ahead and do 5% of 813. And again, we had mentioned that 5% is the same thing as taking 10% and dividing it by 2. So what I'm suggesting that we do is take our 80 cents and divide it by 2. So that's going to come out to about 40 cents. So we have all of our pieces now. 10%, which is going to be our 80 cents, plus our 5%, which is our 40 cents, is going to give us about $1.20. Awesome. Okay, so from here, I just wanted to talk about one more item, and that's going to be 1%. One percents are similar to the 10%. So again, a 1%, that's equivalent to 1/100th, or in other words, 1 out of 100. So take a look. So before, when we were moving that decimal to the left, note how many times we moved it. We only moved it once when we were dealing with 10%, because if you think about it, 1 over 10, how many zeros are included in that fraction? In this case, we want to take a look at our fraction and note how many zeros are underneath, or in the denominator of this fraction. So this is going to tell me how many times I actually have to move my decimal if I choose to do a shortcut instead of the longer way. So in this case, for example, let's do 1% of 50 to begin with. So the shortcut would be take your 50, locate where that decimal point is, and this time move it in 2 spaces. So that means that our solution is going to be 5/10, or if you leave the 0 in there, 50/100ths. They are the same thing. If you did this the longer way, we could go ahead and do 50 times 100th. So 1 times 0 is 0, 1 times 5 is 5. If you do that second line, then we would want to put a 0 to hold its place, and then 0 times 0, and 0 times 5. I mean, so you technically don't have to do that bottom one if you're just multiplying by a 0. If we add down, and then we want to note how many digits are after the decimal place in our multiplication problem, so that's 2. So again, notice that we do get 5/10, or in other words, 50/100ths. Well, further, if we did 1% of 50, we could go ahead and also do, let's see here, 50 over 100. Those zeros would automatically cancel, and notice that this is a 5/10, or in other words, a 1/2, which is 5/10, or 50/100ths. Okay, let's take a look at a couple more. I know this video is a little bit longer. Let's now look at 1% of 1,900. Okay, so I'm just going to do the shortcuts this time, so feel free to pause the video if you would like in order to answer this before listening to the solution. So what I would suggest doing is we're going to take our 1,900, and again, we're going to take our decimal point, and let's maybe make that a little bit darker, and I'm going to move that in 2 spaces because that's going to represent 1%, because again, I'm essentially dividing this by 100. Okay, so that means that my answer is going to come out to 19. Finally, if we did something like 1% of a decimal value, say like 12 3/10, we can still use that shortcut, and actually it's nicer in a sense because the decimal point is visible. So if we take our 12 3/10, again, since I'm dealing with a 1% here, I'm going to locate that decimal point, and I'm going to move it in 2 spaces. So my solution now is going to become 123 thousandths. So I hope that this explanation was helpful. There are going to be a couple other application videos for Section 7.4 coming up, so please make sure that you do take the time to observe those. Thank you.